everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be going over the books that I read in the first quarter of the year, so January, February, and March. I've actually read a decent amount this year. I think because I've been traveling so much, I've been able to kind of read like on planes and stuff, like in airports when I'm just waiting for stuff. So I feel like I've actually read kind of a decent amount, maybe more than I have in other years. So the first book I read, let me check Goodreads. So the first book I read this year was Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. I've read quite a few other Steinbecks. I've read The Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, East of Eden, and Travels with Charlie. I'm kind of familiar with Steinbeck and how he writes. This book had actually been recommended to me by my grandparents, and they've been trying to get me to read it for years. Yeah, it was a good installment from John Steinbeck. Yeah, I think it's a really funny story. I think it's pretty entertaining. In terms of how I would rate it against his other books, I wouldn't say it's like top tier, but it's still like an enjoyable read. So I would recommend it. I would probably give it 3.5 or 4 stars. Okay, the next book I read, I actually have. If I don't have it with me, it's because I read it on my Kindle because I can't afford to have a physical book for every book I read. This is the second book I read, The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. This was a great book. I actually heard it was turned into a movie pretty recently. I'm not sure if it's directly out, but at least in Thailand, I don't think it's playing in any theaters. But this was an incredible read. I think really like a good example of historical fiction with really great writing style. There was a twist actually at one point that I was actually super surprised by and impressed. And it's a very sad story, but I think it's well worth your time. And I think Colson Whitehead also wrote The Underground Railroad. I think that's what it is. So I'd be interested to give that a try. Maybe that will be the next book I read from him. And yeah, I would give this 4.5 stars. I think it's definitely one of my favorite of the years. It's a little bit slow paced, but it's a pretty short book, so you can kind of fly through it pretty easily. And yeah, those are my thoughts. Okay, my camera died and I'm not waiting for the battery to charge. I'm just gonna film the rest of this. So the next book I read was The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels. This was a really fun thriller. I guess it's not really a thriller. It's more of like detective fiction, but it's told in a really interesting format where it's kind of like mixed media, where it's like a mix of interviews and emails and newspaper articles and kind of like books within books. So it's kind of like leading you along as this information is discovered, like as the detective Amanda Bailey, is that her name? Yeah, Amanda Bailey, as she's like receiving these emails. So I don't think I've ever quite read a book like this. I read a lot of thrillers and mystery fiction, and this was actually a really unique way to tell this kind of story that I don't think I've ever seen before. I don't think that like the twist at the end is like necessarily super surprising or like, but like how many are that you actually like are legitimately impressed by like how they wrap up. But other than that, I give this like 4.5 stars. Just like pure entertainment wise, it kept me entertained. And that's kind of like what I look for most in reading. The next book I read, I think I read this in February, but I read Murakami's After Dark. This is maybe the third Murakami I've read. I've read Norwegian Wood. What was the other one called? South of the Border West of the Sun. South of the Border West of the Sun. A lot of his books read very similar because he has a very distinct writing style. So it's kind of hard for me to remember like the plots from each of the books. But it's like most of his books aren't like necessarily plot driven, but more of like character studies. And I would say that this was really fun. There was a bit of a psychological, otherworldly kind of undertone that kind of makes it a little spooky when you're reading. Like something about his writing style is kind of like, just kind of like is a little unsettling, which I kind of like. I would give this 4 stars, I think. It's pretty short. It's only like 200, 300 pages, but you can like fly through it so easily. And I did underline a couple things because I was just so impressed by his writing style, and the way that he talks about characters is just so enjoying. I honestly love books that are more character driven than they are plot driven, because I feel like you just learn so much more, or it's just kind of like so much more interesting to like delve that way into like a character. The rest of the books I don't have in physical form. The next book I read was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I haven't read any of the author's other books. I think they wrote Babel and The Poppy Wars, I'm pretty sure. But this is my first foray into reading this author. And I quite enjoyed it. It was honestly kind of like a thriller a little bit. You know that the main protagonist is doing these like really shady, sketchy things. And like they just keep going, they just keep digging their feet further in. But I honestly think that this is a book that you should go into not really knowing that much like about the plot before you do, because like things just like develop so quickly. It's so page turning. I would recommend it. Definitely a book. I don't think I've ever read something like this where the main protagonist is so unlikable, but like in a purposeful way, where the author like is very aware of that and once is like purposely writing them as an unlikable character. You're kind of like on the edge of your seat, like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen next? The next book I read was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which was super popular like a couple years ago. Almost gave me Ready Player One vibes, where it's very like steeped in the 80s. Is it 80s? 80s or 90s? I think 80s. Like 80s iconography, kind of popular stuff from that time period. Definitely an enjoyable read. I like flew through that book. It was so much fun. It's not YA, but it kind of reads as like, I don't know, just like one of those award-winning books that you read and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so enjoyable. I would give it 4 stars. Next book I read was Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart. Oh my gosh, this was like, it's only 3 months into the year, but this is like the favorite book I've read this year. It's so incredible, so incredibly sad, but it's such an important read. Writing is so lyrical. It's like written so beautifully, but about such like a sad life and sad lives. Really heartbreaking, but it's just so beautiful. I know Douglas, is that what his name is? Douglas Stewart? He also wrote Shuggie Bain, and I haven't read it yet, but I almost picked that up immediately after I finished Young Mungo, because I was like, this author is onto something that I really enjoy. Like, I definitely would love to read like all that this author has put out. So 5 stars. I think this is probably the only 5 stars I've given this year. So worth your time. Couldn't recommend it more. The last book I've read so far this year, Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. This, like, growing up reading The Hunger Games, I love The Hunger Games. One of my favorite franchise series all time. As for the quality of the book, it lived up to my expectations. It was so imaginative. Even though like it's been so long since the first books came out, Suzanne Collins has been able to like create like just another interesting world, like different aspects of this world that we know so well, that I'm impressed that she was able to do this. Some of the characters that show up feels a little bit like you're like, it's kind of convenient. I'm really hoping that she's gonna make like, I think she's gonna make this like another trilogy kind of. And honestly, like if she kept putting out books from The Hunger Games, I would keep reading. Like my whole life, I would keep reading. I'm kind of suspecting like maybe if she were to write a next one, I think she would probably either write like Phoenix or Joanna's Games. But we'll see. That kind of wraps it up for what I've read so far this year. I'm currently reading The Decagon House Murders. I'm almost halfway through. I'm enjoying it so far. Basically, it's like Clue vibes or Agatha Christie vibes, where it's a certain set of people kind of trapped in a location, and then like slowly one by one, they're murdered, killed off. That's one of my favorite tropes in mystery fiction. It's kind of like mimicking And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. We'll see if it lives up to that. So far, I'm pretty entertained. As for like books that I kind of have on my docket to read next. I have still not read the new Sally Rooney book, Intermezzo. I will read anything that that woman puts out. I've heard that like some people don't really like this new book, but I will have to judge that for myself. I have some Peter Swanson thrillers that I would kind of like to read. If I end up traveling somewhere, I think those are good books, like to have if I'm on a train or a bus. But yeah, I've been enjoying reading recently. Let me know what you guys are reading. I definitely need some book recommendations because I have a lot on like what that I'm thinking of reading, but it would be good to know like if you guys have any recommendations. I definitely know I want to read some more Elena Ferrante books this year. Last year I read her whole My Brilliant Friend series. Whole writing project of that is absolutely it's 10 stars. It's so good. I think her writing is so amazing. Her character study of those girls is just absolutely incredible. So I want to read anything that that woman has put out. Yeah, like I said in the comments, please let me know what you guys are reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.